Hi there. This was the week that Justin Trudeau completed his transformation from being the Brad Pitt of Canadian politics into Mr. Bean, some otherworldly character living in some alternate reality. The Prime Minister had a cunning plan to force his Finance Minister, Freeland, to deliver a fall economic update that she didn't agree with, then let her take the brickbats for a deficit that was $20 billion higher than had been advertised, and then use it as an excuse to replace her with Mark Carney. In the event, Chrystia Freeland got her retaliation in first, quitting and leaving Trudeau without her or without Carney, who seems to have decided to stay out of Trudeau's orbit altogether. To unpack this unprecedented and wacky week in Canadian politics, I'm joined by Brodie, who's the former Chief of Staff to Stephen Harper and is currently a politics professor at the University of Calgary, and by Eugene, who is an assistant professor at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University and a former Chief of Staff to two Liberal Defence Ministers. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to see you, John.
Good to be here.
Thanks for coming on again. And we did do this kind of prognostication bit this time last year, and nobody predicted this kind of outcome. So let's hope we have better luck. I want to look at what happened in more detail later, but let's start off the top, put you on the spot, and ask you, what do you think comes next for Justin Trudeau and for the Liberal Party? Start with you, Ian.
John, I think there's a process, I gather, going on inside the Liberal Party, trying to sort out if the party can have a shortened leadership campaign, ideally one that's not contested. It looks like with the configuration of forces, that's going to be impossible to have an uncontested leadership campaign. So I think what they will find is that there will be, if the Prime Minister resigns as leader of the party, a 5 or 6 month leadership campaign that will take us 5 months past or 5 months into a tariff war with the United States. And so the Liberals are, I think, in a very difficult situation of trying to decide whether to push him out or continue to try to push him out. The prospect that there'll be 5 months of economic wreckage in the background of their leadership campaign, or to try to make do as is, with the possibility the government would be toppled at the end of January when the House of Commons comes back. It's an unenviable situation, but I don't see too many other paths forward.
Right. I mean, that leaves Canada without a captain in the ensuing trade negotiations, unless Doug Ford or Danielle Smith are deemed to be leading the charge there, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a limit to how much I think you can lead a national effort from the provincial side, with the greatest of respect to those two provincial premiers. And I think for all of the toing and froing about what's going on inside the governing party, the big threat here is we face economic headwinds. It's hard to think of anything since 1929, 25% or even 5%, ramping up to 25% tariffs across the board on the Canadian economy leads to very quick economic devastation by the first week of February. And for the country to be left with kind of an uncertain political leadership at this time is almost the worst possible inheritance for the governing party to leave to their fellow citizens.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Gene?
Well, irrespective of Mr. Trudeau's troubles and the Liberal Party's troubles, I think job one is we need a functioning government in Ottawa, and we don't really have that right now. We've got ministers that are double and in one case triple-hatted, meaning they've got 2 or 3 portfolios that they're responsible for. Got all kinds of holes in the ministry, and they need to be filled ASAP. My understanding is, I think it was released in the media an hour or so ago that there will be a cabinet shuffle tomorrow to fill some of these holes, and some of those new ministers, there's going to need to be new ministers, I think, coming out of the back benches of the Liberal caucus. That will make 2 or 3 Liberal caucus members happy and about 100 really antagonized if they aren't already antagonized. So I suspect over the weekend you'll see more caucus members that didn't make the cabinet coming out demanding Mr. Trudeau's resignation. So the bank run on the National Bank of Justin Trudeau will continue and accelerate over the coming days, I think. I don't know whether he has made up his mind what he's going to do. I have no insight, certainly no inside information on that. But to me, it's looking like him continuing is untenable. It's just a question of how long, how painful he makes the exit for himself. People say, well, there's no mechanism to get rid of a leader. I remember Ian and I were talking about this in Halifax about a month ago. Yes, there is a mechanism. If 100 caucus members go in front of a microphone, in front of the national media, that leader is gone. And that may be where we're heading.
I mean, you say it seems untenable, but it seems to be tenable to him. I mean, he does seem to live in this sort of bubble of his own self-narrative. And he's going to have a cabinet shuffle, which suggests that he's still going to be there at the helm. August the 3rd, he becomes the 6th longest-serving Prime Minister, ahead of Stephen Harper. He's got the G7 in Alberta in June. Would anybody place bets against him being at either of those events?
Well, I think Gene talked about this pending cabinet shuffle with all of these holes in the cabinet long before we get to a G7 meeting in June. I think the task facing the government to try to fill those holes must be an extremely difficult burden to try to get over, since it seems there's a third of the caucus that wants him to go. Presumably you can't appoint any of them. It looks like there's about a third of the caucus that isn't quite sure what to do. And I don't know if you want to rely on any of them, since they might be out the door from a cabinet, just after Christmas. You're in a very small piece of that caucus that they think they can depend upon. But on Friday last week, they thought they could depend upon the former finance minister. You're trying to get people who want to come in the middle of a disintegration of the government. I assume those people are going to want to hear from the Prime Minister before they agree to serve in cabinet what the plan is for getting through this. And it's becoming less and less clear that there's a viable path through that. Again, long before we get to G7, long before we get to the August where he moves up in the livelihood tables for Prime Minister rankings, there's the inauguration of the new president in the United States and the beginnings of a tariff war. If we start to see thousands and thousands and thousands of job losses sometime around the end of January, the beginning of February, how long does that cabinet hold on? Who wants to become public safety minister and therefore number one on Mr. Trump's target list in the Canadian government after Mr. Trudeau, tomorrow morning? That's asking an awful lot of even your most solid caucus colleagues, and I don't know that they have a very good list of who their most solid caucus colleagues are.
Somebody just emailed me, a reader, saying, is it possible that Trump was the cause of Freeland getting turfed? I mean, she did take part in this taking on the tyrant panel when he was president first time around, and he even mentioned that we don't like their representative, meaning her. I guess it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that he was the catalyst for all this. Anyway, I know we don't know that. So, but let's go back 1 week. You mentioned last Friday, Ian. 1 week ago, Trudeau had a Zoom call with Freeland, telling her he wanted to replace her, which, with hindsight, seems to have been the worst political idea since Prohibition. Carney had not committed himself to becoming finance minister. I spoke to people over the weekend who were close to the Prime Minister, as they say, and he said there were a lot of moving parts. So Carney had clearly not committed himself. It doesn't surprise me, knowing him. He's mildewed with caution. So there appear to have been two plans. One is that Trudeau would replace Freeland with Carney, and another that he would shuffle another minister into that seat. Yet when Freeland had resigned, they seemed to be scurrying about with no plan, no idea who was going to take his place. It just seems to have been complete chaos. Eugene, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, it's complete chaos. I mean, I've been in Ottawa for 30 years. I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of screw-ups on the part of governments. I've been involved in some. I've never seen anything like this. This is unfathomable level of incompetence in the Prime Minister's office and in the Prime Minister's head. Not just in the fact that they got rid of Freeland, in the way they did it you have to shake your head. It's done apparently over a Zoom call. It's not a kind of even an attempt to make a lateral move, maybe to put her back into foreign affairs. It sounds like it's really a serious demotion, barely even in the cabinet. You know, the most senior minister this government has had for the last 4 or 5 years, who's held 3 senior portfolios for 9 years, is the second most prominent person in the government. And she's really done nothing terribly wrong. You can criticize her record, but it's not like she's responsible for a scandal or something. And they're literally gutting her and expecting her to take, I guess, minister without portfolio and just carry on as a good soldier. The way it's been handled, I just can't explain it. It's like nobody was thinking this through at all. Nobody had any understanding of how she might react to this. The Prime Minister's office, as Ian will know, one of the key things they're supposed to know is their ministers. They're supposed to understand their ministers really well. Clearly, they have no understanding of these ministers, because this is not the first time we've seen a debacle like this in a cabinet shuffle on the part of this government, but this one is at a scale that is just unimaginable.
I mean, so he appoints LeBlanc as finance minister. Whether LeBlanc went willingly, who knows? But he's just done an interview with David Hurley saying that he's not an expert in economics, which is clearly not ideal in a finance minister. On the other hand, to me, he is far and away the best person to put as a point person in dealing with the Trump administration. So, I mean, it's like improv night. Is there anything to be said for the way that's been handled, Ian?
No. I agree with Gene's assessment here. I mean, look, a cabinet shuffle is difficult to do at the best of times because as soon as you're moving, you can't just move one person in a cabinet shuffle. Every time you move one person, there's other dominoes that have to fall, and trying to get the circle to close itself is not easy. You're dealing with people's career expectations. This is not like trying to pull off a corporate reorganization. It all goes on in the public eye. There'll be thousands of hours of pundit speculation about who did what during the shuffle. This gets caught up with people's ego and future and so forth. So I don't want to underestimate how difficult it was going to be. But I'm not sure I also entirely buy the story that this all started on Friday with a Zoom call, because there are some other facts we have to keep in mind here. The public accounts, the sort of the annual legal statement of the government's finances for last year, the year that ended last March, would ordinarily have been out in September or October. That was delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. Other financial reporting that's sort of routine. I mean, just the stuff of, with the greatest respect to my friends in the finance department, work for mid-range people in the finance department to get some numbers together and to send them out, quarterly and monthly. It's not high-stakes political work. Has also all been on hold for months. The government is, by my calculation, a year behind in releasing its every 3-year plan for managing the public debt. I think that was due, if I'm right, last November. And so all of this has been on hold for months and months and months in the case of the public accounts. This is something that everybody outside of government who's worried about public finances pays attention to. That all speaks to a dispute that must have been going on for months. The fact that the economic update or fall economic statement, or whatever we call it this year, was delayed from kind of October into November into December into kind of the Christmas period, itself also reflects either a deep dysfunction of the government's planning process or a deep dispute between the finance minister and the prime minister. So I think this idea that this was somehow, the prime minister's chief of staff went off to Christmas or went off to New York for the Christmas holidays on Friday or Saturday, and something fell between the cracks and so on and so forth. That part of the story doesn't add up either. There's been some kind of problem going on here for quite some time. The idea that the prime minister's office might have underestimated how serious it was is a major fault, and we are now into a crisis period in Canada-U.S. economic relations that we haven't seen ever, or we haven't seen since Wilfrid Laurier was prime minister, and so the inability to manage through this is going to have real-world consequences beyond the Ottawa bubble for months and months and years and years and years to come, and there's just no excuse for that.
Mm-hmm. So Freeland says she is running again, which effectively kicks off her leadership campaign, I guess. Two thoughts occurred to me on that. One was Michael Heseltine's quote when he failed to unseat Margaret Thatcher, which was, he that wields the knife never wears the crown. And secondly, it's related to what you're talking about, Ian, that we immediately wreathe ministers who resign in this kind of imaginary brightness. And yet, Freeland didn't resign on principle. She was basically going to be demoted. So it would seem to me to be unconvincing for her to say that she's a pivot away from Trudeau. She was basically on side with Trudeau right up until until the affordability package with the checks and the GST holiday came out. Dominic LeBlanc would now appear to be too tied to Trudeau to convince anybody he's a change. And do you think that applies also to Melanie Joly and Champagne and Anita Anand and anybody else who's currently in cabinet? Gene?
Yeah, those that are left in the senior positions are the last of the loyalists, if you will. It seems to me, and as we all know, Dominic LeBlanc has known Mr. Trudeau longer than any of them. They go back to childhood, I guess. And I presume it's a very close relationship. And so, yeah, that's what the core of the cabinet is left. Those that are, I guess, considered to be deeply loyal and will follow him through thick and thin. But I guess they must have assumed might have assumed that was the case with Miss Freeland until Friday, because presumably they thought she was going to accept what they offered her. And again, there's an incredible misreading of her status in the government, whether you like her or not, and I'm not a particular fan, by the way. Her status in the government was almost unparalleled in any government I've seen in 30 years. We haven't had somebody, maybe with the exception of Paul Martin, back in the Chrétien government. You don't normally see a finance minister and first of all, you rarely see a finance minister and deputy prime minister combined like that, that's playing all of these roles, chairing all of these committees, the voice of the government, always at the prime minister's side through thick and thin, regardless of the issues. And then you just gut her on a Friday afternoon. I agree with Ian, this has been brewing for a long time. The knives went out for her after the by-election loss in St. Paul's back in June, when the prime minister's office started leaking disparaging comments about her abilities as a campaigner or a communicator or whatever. So it started some time ago and it's built over time. Fair enough. If you want to move her, but you don't do it this way. That's my point. You have to treat a minister like this with a lot more respect and a lot more care. And frankly, at this point in the government's mandate, when they are so low in the polls and Trudeau's popularity is so low, if you're going to move Freeland, you almost need to negotiate that with her as to where she's going to go in your government. You just don't say, this is where you're going. Suck it up. And that's apparently, it seems to me at least, that's what happened. And just terrible management all around. You don't even know where to begin.
Ian, what about Mark Carney? He seems to be the one that the Poilievre team are most worried about. They certainly attacked him on Monday when Freeland resigned.
Well, I think in a certain sense, for the Poilievre agenda, or for the Poilievre style of politics at the moment, I'm not sure they're worried about Mark, but so much as Mark is the easiest target. Remember, Mr. Poilievre sort of vaulted himself forward in the Conservative leadership race by attacking Tiff Macklem, the governor of the Bank of Canada, rightly in my assessment. Mark was his predecessor as governor of the Bank of Canada. He's the kind of the ultimate of the globalist financial elite, and sort of signed on to this very peculiar, almost Elon Musk-like role with the Trudeau government, where he was going to be an economic advisor, but not taken on to the strength of the government, and therefore not subject to any of the conflict of interest rules, so he could keep all of his corporate gigs and God knows whatever the compensation package is for that. Mr. Carney's efforts to try to sort of turn himself into a populist with online videos of himself drinking carbonated beer-like beverages at put together hoser-like events in the middle of Quebec. Obviously, an effort to try to roll back at Mr. Poilievre's attacks here. I didn't think particularly effectively. but it helps that Carney is at least a name that is known in some parts of the circle. The rest of the team, it's not clear to me that if Mr. Poilievre went after too many of the other candidates who are apparently lining themselves up for the Liberal leadership, that the names would have any resonance at all, because it's not in the nature of cabinet ministers, even senior cabinet ministers, to have much of a public pull outside of Ottawa.
Somebody mentioned to me, by the way, that if the Liberal membership votes, we could have a lot of non-citizens and non-permanent residents voting who becomes the next Prime Minister, which in the mood of the times, foreign interference and such, may not be optimal.
Well, I think you've got to assume that given the very peculiar leadership roles that the party adopted over the course of the past few years in the Trudeau era, that in fact the next Liberal leader will be largely chosen by people who aren't really Canadian citizens, or aren't Canadian citizens at all, I should say, and that therefore that opens the door to all sorts of interference and all sorts of leadership shenanigans of the sort that every party has to deal with during a leadership race, but with no guardrails of any kind. So just as there are no fiscal guardrails for the government's budget anymore, there's no citizenship guardrail for the selection of the next Prime Minister in the hands of whoever wants to click like on the Liberal Party button on Facebook.
Yeah. Let's briefly look at the other parties. The Liberal vote in the by-election in Cloverdale, Langley City, which happened on Monday and was almost ignored, it went down 23%, but the NDP share of the vote fell by 7%. I mean, it would seem to me that NDP voters should be chasing Jagmeet Singh from his chair if he can't profit from the unpopularity of Justin Trudeau. Gene?
Yeah, well, this is the only thing Trudeau has going for him, which is the NDP's weaker than he is, or they're weaker than the Liberals, and Singh seems to be weaker than Trudeau, so that's the lifeline. I've got data for a new poll that's coming out, I think, tomorrow from Voice of Frankie, our friend Frank Graves at ECOS, who's been in the field this week between the 16th and 18th, so through the Freeland debacle, and he has the Liberals and the NDP tied at 19%. And the Conservatives at 44%, and I think the Bloc's at 37% in the province of Quebec. So what we've seen over the last year is, or more, erosion of the Liberal vote, and many people would assume, well, a lot of that vote should redound to the benefit of the NDP. It doesn't seem to have happened at all. It's going to the Conservatives for whatever reason, which I think is a surprise to a lot of people. The NDP seems incredibly weak. And as I say, this is the one sort of benefit, I guess, or lifeline Trudeau has. It seems unlikely that they certainly don't want to defeat the government. There's nothing in it for them. They run the risk of being wiped out in the election as bad as the Liberals are running the risk of being wiped out.
Ian, did you want to touch on the NDP? I mean, it would seem Jagmeet Singh does not have is running out of options as far as continuing to prop up Trudeau.
Yeah, I disagree with Eugene's assessment here. I mean, it could be right, but I take a different view of the coming year for the NDP, which is really what's relevant here. I mean, Mr. Singh has now run a 2019 election where he lost half of his seats, and a 2021 election where he lost basically half of his seats. So this is not a strong.
2021, he maintained. I think he maybe even added one, but he didn't make gains.
Okay, yeah, didn't make gains. Sorry, so he's down half of the caucus since he took over as leader, and some important members of his own caucus are not running again in seats that he will struggle to hold with another candidate, I would think. But I've got to say, the NDP's returned to its kind of historic normal around that kind of 17, 18% mark. So I don't think that's terrible in that case. And the future does not look strong here. On Monday, I think after Ms. Freeland's resignation, Mr. Singh could have come out and said, I no longer have confidence in the government, there must be an election. I think that might have forced the matter that day. The fact that he didn't do that now means he, in a certain sense, is responsible for whatever comes next, including not really having a fully in-charge government through the beginning of a very brutal trade war with the United States. So if we do see tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of layoffs possible through a trade war into February and March, how long can Mr. Singh hold on as the auto industry in Ontario, the aerospace industry, all highly unionized businesses are sort of at the front end of the impact of a trade war. I don't see things getting better. I think he made a strategic blunder on Monday, an epic strategic blunder on Monday by not pushing for an election. The polls do show that between the two parties, at least on the kind of center to center left of the political spectrum, there is kind of, 35, 38% support between the two parties. If pushing for an election with Mr. Trudeau as leader gave him some opportunity to gain strength during the election campaign when people start to pay attention, I just think he gave up, was in a certain sense, the NDP's best chance for the coming year. And I think that will be a price this party will pay through the first part of 2025.
Looking at the Conservatives, it seems to me that Poilievre seems to have some kind of inverse relationship with Trudeau, not just in the polls, but in performance. The more at sea the Prime Minister seems to be, the more assured Poilievre seems to be. I think he had a pretty good week in the House. He seems to have ditched the slogans and some of the nastiness that turned some people off. I mean, I guess it's a function of the cycle, like in sports. If you're winning, it's easier to play well. But he does seem to be thriving in this environment. Gene, do you agree?
Oh yeah, I agree. He's thriving. I haven't noticed the moderation that you have, but I don't follow it as closely as you do. But yeah, he's thriving. I mean, the government's falling apart, and when governments fall apart, some other party benefits from it. This is our history, and in this case, that party's benefiting from it. I know many people who are kind of fair weather liberals or center right people that have decided they're going to vote for Mr. Poilievre, for the Conservatives, no matter what. No matter what he says, no matter what he does. The die is cast. I think that this is almost certainly going to be a Conservative majority government. I don't even think Mr. Poilievre needs an election platform to win the election. In fact, it might be risky for him to have an election platform. This is going to be a referendum on Justin Trudeau if he stays as the leader. If he changes, if he leaves and there's a new leader, well, that might change the dynamic at the margins. But I think the Conservatives are marching towards a majority government, and it may be a historic majority government in terms of its size.
Ian?
I think, let me just say that Mr. Poilievre, whom I've known for a very long time, is a very disciplined and very strategic political leader. I mean, he's since he became leader, I can't think of a moment where he's put a foot wrong, and he's picked his fights very carefully. He's been right in the things that he has said, and I don't think he gets enough credit for the two big things that he said that he was right about. The first one was that loose fiscal policy and loose monetary policy kind of 3 years ago was going to lead to an inflation crisis. And he was poo-pooed for that by all sorts of people on all sorts of business pages and so forth. But it turned out he was right about that. And I think, and Tiff Macklem, by the way, was wrong about that. And Miss Freeland was wrong about that. So I think we have to give credit that before he became leader, he was taking some big positions that got him into a certain amount of controversy. But he was right, and his critics were wrong. And then earlier this fall, he said of the Trudeau government's kind of cost of living kind of efforts, a series of political gimmicks that the country can ill afford. It turns out the person who agreed with that the most was the finance minister at the time. There are lots of people who said, "Oh no, these kinds of $250 here and the Hanukkah Bush tax credit or whatever it was is what the prime minister needs to do to get back 5% in the polls." Yeah. It turns out Mr. Poilievre was right about that. And so, I think there's reason, the self-assurance showed on Monday when it's possible people were looking at him for the first time in quite a while. This is probably a smaller part of the electorate than we're used to, but some people would have tuned in to see what he had to say. And what did he say? He made a direct appeal to patriotic liberals, to Eugene, to John Manley, to Paul Martin liberals, everywhere, and said, this is chaos, it's a clown show, for the good of the country, we have to have a change, and I'm looking for your support. I thought that was also a good step.
It was interesting that people who helped write Trudeau's convention speech in 2014 pointed that out to me today. If you remember, Trudeau stood up and said, Conservatives aren't your enemies, they're your neighbours.
Right.
And now we've got Poilievre essentially saying the same thing. So that's kind of interesting. And Trudeau is a million miles from that speech that he made in 2014.
No, I think Poilievre and his people correctly understood that he was speaking to what was potentially a slightly different audience than normal on Monday, and you saw the change in the focus of the message.
Yeah,
for sure,
enough,
for sure. Now we've kind of had some fun at well, mainly Justin Trudeau's expense, but about the political game in Ottawa, and yet, Ian, as you've continually pointed out, there is a far more serious, high stakes game that is about to kick off with the US once Trump is inaugurated at the end of January. What is the best case scenario for Canada in the opinion of the both of you? Ian, if you want to start.
You want me to go first?
Well,
best case scenario.
Whoever's got anything that can say that's constructive.
I'll give you time to think about it, Ian. The best case scenario, I guess, is that Trump is bluffing, but I don't buy that. I don't think he's bluffing. I wrote something on this in the Globe and Mail about 2 weeks ago. I think he's bluffing on the 25% in my view, but he's not bluffing on the tariff. No,
just on that, Gene, because he did say, when he wrote this ridiculous tweet about the 51st state and Freeland going, he did say that's not the way to get a deal, which to me at least signaled there is a deal to be had.
It's part of the deal. So you start at 25, you end up at 10, you extract all kinds of concessions from your weak negotiating partner, which he's already achieved just by having Trudeau go to Mar-a-Lago and then follow up with some tweets. He's already achieved, $1 billion in border concessions. I think over the next 4 to 6 weeks, he's going to extract more concessions because he sees that Canada is weak. It has weak leadership. It's in a desperate position right now, and he's going to take advantage of that. My guess is the best case scenario is we end up getting hit with maybe targeted tariffs rather than a universal tariff, probably of around 10%. And maybe over time we can chip away at that if we do other things that the Americans want, or maybe we just suck it up and try to live with it. But I do believe that those who think that this is just a negotiating tactic and that Trump will not impose a tariff at the end of the day at some level are wrong, because if you look at what Trump has said for years about tariffs, he fundamentally believes in the economics of tariffs. He actually takes a principled stand in some ways. It's an old 19th century mercantilist view of tariffs, but it's not a fringe view actually in the history of global trade. It's just we haven't heard it this way really very frequently in recent years, especially from a U.S. president. He believes tariffs work for the United States. He says things like, said it last week, they're going to make us rich. What does he mean by that? He means the revenue that the U.S. government is going to accrue from it, some estimates of which show up to $200 or $300 billion a year in revenue. He believes it will result in more economic activity, more manufacturing activity in the United States. It may well do so at a cost to the consumer, for sure. It's not efficient. It's not going to be good overall for the U.S. economy. But he has a different worldview about tariffs. And I think we're being really dismissive when we just say, well, he doesn't really mean it, and tariffs are going to be bad for the consumer in the United States and bad for the U.S. economy. He doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe it's going to be bad for the U.S. economy.
Yeah.
So get ready for tariffs. I just don't think it'll be at 25%, or at least I hope it won't.
Ian?
Well, let's think this through from January 20th onwards. Let's say sometime on January 20th or shortly thereafter, we end up with a 5 or 10% tariff, maybe 5% that he announces will go up to 10% or something like that, at the low end of the estimates that are being thrown around. That will have a cost. It has a cost here. The cost here will be more serious than it is in the United States because we're more trade exposed than the U.S. economy is. But there will be a cost in the United States. The question is, how quickly will those costs manifest themselves, and how quickly will U.S. business leaders and U.S. Consumer leaders, because it's not just Canada, he's talking about Mexico and China as well, so this covers an enormous amount the United States is not really a big trading country as a percentage of their GDP, but if the trade that they do, that's the big piece of it. And for some of the products that they need to then feed their manufacturing base and so on, some of those are sort of crucial inputs. I think the question is, how soon in February or March can American business leaders and American consumer leaders and American political leaders, to be honest, feed back to Trump that there needs to be some reconsideration of this? Because I think the worst case scenario is not that the Trump tariff plan fails, but in some senses, I think Eugene's pointing at that it might work. And then if it works, there's no limit to it. And then we're in for a very difficult situation, both in Canada and in Mexico. The Chinese may have some other options, but I'm not sure that we do.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're out of time. Many thanks for your expertise. Merry Christmas to you and your families.
Merry Christmas, John.
After all that,
Merry Christmas, Gene.
It may be our last.
And please, God give us happy Hogmanay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks again. All the best.
Take care.